I am so happy to see you here tonight. We're due for a real treat. But I wanted to focus just a greeting for you on Diane Knippers. Most of you know that this is a series named for Diane and that she was president of IRD for 20 years?
She was with us for almost 25, president for half of them.
Okay. Her history and Mark's history and the history of IRD are very intricately linked. Diane was a wonderful person, and we're very privileged tonight to have her parents here. Would you stand? Mr. and Mrs. Lemasters, Diane's parents are here. Her husband Ed is in the back. Please stand, Ed. Ed is a renowned artist. He and Diane had a marriage that was very exemplary. I admired them tremendously. Ed and I were colleagues on the faculty at Asbury College for a number of years, and Diane was a dear friend then and remained a dear friend here in D.C. when we came to D.C. I can think of no greater tribute to her and her contribution to public policy than to have this series named for her and to bring such stellar lecturers to D.C. to talk with us about very important issues. So thank you for being here. Thank you for honoring Diane by being here, and thank you for your interest in the IRD.
Thank you, Janice. Diane was president from 1993 to 2005. Am I getting those dates correct, Ed? And I was hired by her in 1994. And at this point, we have only one IRD staffer who is more senior to myself, who was also hired by Diane, and that is Faith McDonald, our Religious Liberty Director. So Faith, you are here.
Was it?
Well, I have so many memories of Diane that it would be hard to come up with anything to tell you, but I do want to say what a joy it was and what a privilege it was to work for her. When I came to IRD in the fall of 1993, I was a lot younger than I am now. I didn't even have a child. Now I have an 18-year-old daughter. So, and I guess that's where I'd like to just start. Diane was so supportive of me in family life and letting me tote Fiona everywhere we went together, to general conventions, to diocesan councils, to demonstrations at the Sudan embassy, all kinds of things. And I believe that it enriched my daughter's life as well. When Fiona was born, Diane gave her a present. She gave her a book of art. And I think Ed probably had something to do with finding that book as well. It was Sister Wendy's, if you remember Sister Wendy, talking about art. And she was just always so supportive, both of that and of me in my work. I started out as Diane's assistant, and she was very gracious when she learned that my passion was the persecuted church around the world, to letting me go from the job that I'd been hired for and becoming more involved in religious liberty work, and then finally becoming the director of the program. So she was a wonderful person. We love her and we miss her. I'll tell you one fun thing that happened was when Diane went to Beijing to the UN Women's Conference. We had a little system worked out that in case she got in trouble with the communist government, she would call us on the phone and she would say, "The chicken's in the pot." So we thought, we would never hear this saying, but it turned out one day while she was away that it was Alan Wisdom's IRD anniversary. So we all went out to what's it called? The Cheesecake Factory. Thank you. I was going to say the Magic Pan, but that was another restaurant from the past, yeah. And we were out quite a bit in the afternoon. And apparently Diane had been needing to get a hold of us, not because the CPC was after her, but just for other reasons. And we came back to hear on the recording machine, the chicken's in the pot, the chicken's in the pot, several times. So we got in touch with her right away. But I know that she would love to know that Dr. Abraham was speaking tonight. She was just... Her mind was amazing, and the way she tied things together with the reform needed in the church. And actually, when the first week I came to IRD, we were having a conference on church reform, and I had to go pick up Dr. Abraham, so I'm coming full circle, getting to hear him again tonight. So God bless you all, and thank you.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you. Thanks, Terry.
Before introducing our speaker, just some logistics. Our reception this evening will not be in the church, but will be in the Henley Park Hotel, which is immediately out the door and to the left, just literally maybe 30 steps away. So I hope all of you will join us there for that. This being a Methodist church, there is a no alcohol policy here. So out of respect for those of you who are not Methodist, when you go next door, you Episcopalians and Presbyterians can imbibe over there. As Faith mentioned, Diane Knippers knew Billy Abraham, and in fact, I first met Billy Abraham thanks to Diane Knippers when, as Faith mentioned, Billy was the featured speaker at a IRD conference for church renewal leaders at a monastery outside Baltimore exactly 20 years ago, and of course was a dynamic and entertaining speaker and remains a major thought leader within the church in America, and is one of our most distinguished theologians, certainly at large, but definitely within Methodism in America and in the world. And I won't give you his full biography, but he has written many, many books. He is the Albert Outler Chair of Wesley Studies at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And just a few of the books that he's written include Crossing the Threshold of Divine Revelation, Canon and Criterion in Christian Theology, The Art of Evangelism, An Introduction to the Philosophy of Religion, Canonical Theism, and the most recent book that pertinent to this evening is Shaking Hands with the Devil, The Intersection of Terrorism and Theology. And obviously Christian ethics, just war and terrorism have been very much in the forefront of issues that IRD has been addressing, and so this is especially pertinent to our work. So Billy, we're very grateful and honored that you could be here with us, and come enthrall us with your intellect, if you would.
Well, it's a pleasure to leave the high thinking and low living of Notre Dame, which is where I currently am for a year, to come to the high living and low thinking of Washington, D.C. Actually, I make a confession. I love politics. It's a marvelous indoor sport. But more importantly and straightforwardly, I'm absolutely honored to be here tonight to deliver this lecture in honor of Diane Knippers. I didn't know Diane very well, but all I want to say about her, she was absolutely a class act. So it's the energy that just came from her naturally, the intellectual fecundity, the range of her interests, and just as an absolutely wonderful human being. All of that remains with me from my encounter with Diane Knippers. And please God, when we get to the other side, we'll be able to actually sit down and talk and share war stories. Now, one other preliminary comment. The work I present tonight, the argument I present here tonight, is on the edges of my own research. So that's a way of saying, you know, if I'm in trouble, I can always say, well, I'm just a layperson. My own primary work at the moment is a major 4-volume work on divine agency and divine action. And that's maybe probably 5 to 7 year project. But I think that the issues that relate to what I have to say tonight are absolutely crucial for the future of the church. I think they're crucial for the future of the West and democracies, and therefore I want to bring my own perspective to bear on these matters. Now the topic is that of just war, terrorism, and Christian ethics. I'm going to expand it just a little bit because I think I want to touch also on the issue of pacifism. Now, by terrorism, I mean, in very broad terms, the deliberate use of violence targeted at innocent civilians for political purposes. Now, you can expand that in all sorts of directions, but it's the deliberate use of violence perpetrated against innocent civilians for political purposes. Now, there are other kinds of terrorism, but that's the particular one that I'm interested in. Now, one way for Christians to respond to this, of course, is to deploy the resources of pacifism. So I want to begin there. The central idea of pacifism is that disputes, all disputes, including our social and political disputes, are to be settled without recourse to violence or force. And of course, one obvious advantage of pacifism immediately is that it provides moral justification for the rejection of terrorism. You get it in one fell swoop. If the recourse to violence is generally rejected, then terrorism is rejected, and other ways of resolving disputes must be sought. Now the problem is that the cure proposed by pacifism, in my judgment, turns out to be worse than the disease. By rejecting all use of lethal force, I think that we are bereft of crucial resources in protecting innocent people from lethal attack. Applied to the response to terrorism, pacifism would require that we respond to terrorism without that sanction. We'd have to deal with it without using armed police and without soldiers. That's the consequence. More generally, pacifism entails that we have to construct states without recourse to the ultimate sanction of force. And it seems to me on the face of it, this is just utterly nonsensical. So, in some respects, I find the pacifist position extraordinarily difficult to defend. But being a philosopher, let me try. The commitment to pacifism dies hard. And I think it's important to begin with the distinction between two kinds of pacifism. On the one hand, there are pragmatic pacifists who hold that rejecting the use of lethal force will actually work in the end, even in disputes with terrorism. The claim in this instance is empirical. If we seek out and catalogue non-lethal ways to resolve disputes, these tested practices will work as a response to terrorism. On the other hand, and I'll go into this further in a minute, on the other hand, there are religious pacifists who ground their rejection of lethal force in divine revelation. The claim in this instance is theological through and through. God requires us to eschew the use of lethal force to resolve disputes, whatever the costs in suffering and death. Now you can mix and match, but those two crucial sort of ways of going at it, I think, are important to distinguish. Now, pragmatic pacifists have tried in recent years to develop the practices that would implement their vision of dispute resolution. And they work under the banner of a wonderful slogan called just peacemaking. Thus far, approximately 10 practices have been identified. I have a whole list of them here. I don't want to put you to sleep just yet, but they involve nonviolent direct action, independent initiatives to reduce threat, cooperative conflict resolution, acknowledging responsibility for conflict and injustice and seeking repentance and forgiveness, and there are several others. But the crucial move here in a very sophisticated move, is to develop a set of practices that you would put in place and that would bring about the changes that are required without deploying lethal force. Now, I don't think this is going to work. What we have here, in many ways, is in fact a whole set of sort of causal claims about if you do this, or this, and this, and this will follow. That's fundamentally what's at stake. The problem is that the explanations and predictions offered are so vague and open-textured that you'll always be able to explain, well, if we'd done this, this would be the outcome. And so in my judgment, the carefully constructed air of science or empirical sort of fact or empirical analysis is bogus and misleading. With terrorism, we are dealing first and foremost with human agents and human actions. We're not simply dealing with physical events and causes. So it's going to be very difficult indeed to put together any story of the causal factors that are going to have the outcomes that are promised by, in fact, those who are committed to just peacemaking. Now, if you want to follow up on this, I deal with this in my book on terrorism. The most important defender of this, I think, at the moment is Glenn Stassen from Fuller Theological Seminary. And I think if you look carefully even at his analysis, you end up with these just so stories. And in fact, before he's finished, he has to qualify these claims to such a degree that I think at the end of the day, I think they're very hard to support. Now, let me put the big point I want to make here this way. The revised project of pacifism in this case ignores what I'm going to call the radical particularity of terrorist organizations and activity. And this is a more general problem in the discussions about terrorism, and we want to sort of tie it into religion or whatever else. I think you've got to get to the specific agents in a particular location, their history, what they're doing, why they're doing it. Terrorism in Ireland was brought to its knees, I should say maybe terrorism in the north of Ireland, was brought to its knees in part because inside agents trained by the state infiltrated the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, to the highest levels and hopelessly compromised its operations. Any accountant, I'm sure you've read of this, doesn't know about this. But in actual fact, there were double agents who were right at the top of the IRA. And what that did was, in fact, enabled Gerry Adams and others to simply come to the point where they couldn't win. And then they came to the table. And all the people involved is an amazing story, which I can pick up later. But what I want to get at here is that the radical contingency is not going to fit with any general sort of causal story of how to pull it off. Now, religious pacifists are right, therefore, in my judgment, to reject the logic of pragmatic pacifism. The case does not rely on the happy outcome of just making practices. Religious pacifists, in the Christian tradition, simply see pacifism as a practice in and of itself. They oppose the use of lethal force as a matter of principle. And what they insist on is simply this: God has told us not to use lethal force. Argument over, we're going to obey God rather than human agents. On this analysis, they are prepared to accept suffering and death rather than engage in the lethal use of force. Accepting suffering and death in their analysis is not an irrational option, for the commitment to pacifism is grounded in divine revelation. Now, I'm going to give you a sideways move on this. If you have something that's genuinely grounded in divine revelation, it seems to me you have knowledge. I think here Aquinas was exactly right. In fact, you have the highest form of knowledge. So that's why the problems of suffering and death are not going to be taken seriously at this stage by those who are committed to religious pacifism. Certainly they'll feel the temptation to take up arms in self-defense or to protect their neighbors. But such temptation is to be resisted because it's always overridden by the warrant that you've got within divine revelation. So in the most recent forms of Christian pacifism, proponents have stressed that the practice of pacifism simply rests substantially on divine revelation and on the ecclesial practices, the church practices that are developed within that. And these have been developed particularly by John Howard Uller and by Stanley Hauerwas. For them, the issue is theological through and through. Jesus Christ, fully human and fully divine, revealed how we ought to live. He rejected the use of lethal force. He manifested the consequences of such living, namely suffering and death. He committed his followers to forgiveness and reconciliation in his life and moral mandates. And that opens up a whole set of issues as to whether forgiveness is dependent upon repentance or not. And finally, Jesus Christ made available the power to live in this manner, that's to say, in his resurrection and through Pentecost. This is a very rich way of putting it. Once we step into that world, we need no further warrant for pacifism. It's all in there within the world of faith. Nor can we give reasons for stepping, so to speak, inside the world of divine revelation. You're just in. God put you there. That's why there's an interesting pedigree behind this theologically. The commitment to divine revelation is ultimate. It doesn't rest on reason. And if that's the case, then it's not going to be overturned by any kind of empirical or other considerations. Now, a few have put this as well as Professor Stanley Hauerwas at Duke, and I want to just quote in one case from him. Christians believe that the true history of the world, that history that determines our destiny, is not carried by the nation state. In spite of its powerful moral appeal, this history is the history of godlessness. These are extraordinary claims. Only the church has the stance, therefore, to describe war for what it is. For the world is too broken to know the reality of war. For what is war but the desire to be rid of God, to claim for ourselves the power to determine our meaning and history? Our desire to protect ourselves from our enemies, to eliminate our enemies in the name of protecting the common history we share with our friends, is but the manifestation of our hatred for God. Now that's a nuclear strike, intellectually speaking. Because it means if you really don't agree with this version of pacifism, you hate God. Now, these are claims that got to be taken seriously, and I think if we reject them, we need to know why. Now, again, briefly, I think Hauerwas' vision of the nation-state is obsolete, and I'll come back to that later. But his reductionist and simplistic descriptions of war, if you look at them, are so obviously false that they undercut his claim to possess an exclusively privileged access to the truth about war through the church. Hauerwas, moreover, does not give a persuasive account of where to locate the true church that delivers such coveted goods. Now here is my sort of nuclear strike on the other side very quickly. Truth to tell, Professor Hauerwas, whom I count as a friend, has difficulty in coming to terms with the reality of terrorism, the terrorism of the IRA. Thus, he is perfectly happy to allow the IRA's self-description. This is before they came to the table. He's perfectly happy to allow the IRA's self-description of its activity as war rather than terrorism. War, he says, is relative to each people's history. Thus, we thus often seek to deny to the other side the right to describe their violence as war. For example, barbarians cannot be warriors since they don't fight in a civilized manner. And then he says, a bombing in London by the IRA is not terrorism, but war. I pause there. What this really means is that terrorists can make up their own self-serving descriptions of their evil actions and get a free ride in the name of conceptual relativism. I think that Professor Harwas is incapable in this instance of distinguishing between truth and propaganda. At this level, what his particular observations reveal is not that theologians of his school or church have privileged access to the truth, but that their judgments are subject to intellectual corruption. At this level, it is often not the pious insider, but the perceptive outsider who can help us know what is at stake. To put the matter theologically, we might say that the truth is often more visible through common grace than through purported special grace. There are weeds, if you like, as well as tares in the truth claims of any church. Now, I think that the arrival of Islam as a serious player in the West shows how parochial and unpersuasive Harwas's influential vision or version of Christian pacifism has become. Radical Islamicists and Christian pacifists can agree that revelation should be taken as decisive for action. If we cannot see the crucial status they ascribe to divine revelation, then we have not understood the concept of divine revelation and how it naturally and rightly functions. But an acute problem immediately is that you've now got rival versions of divine revelation on your hands, and it is only an additional problem of the school to which Professor Harwas belongs, that in fact you're simply left with no help whatsoever in fact distinguishing between different versions of divine revelation. And that's what happens, it seems to me, when you lose reason. So there needs to be a much more careful, nuanced account, see the book on divine revelation, as to how we put those two together. Now, let me make sure I stay on place here. I think that even if we give the case for divine revelation in the Christian case, which I would argue for, I think the warrant then that's used by Christians to in fact defend pacifism will not stand secure. The standard and correct objection at this point is that Christian pacifists have taken isolated elements of the teaching of Jesus, say in the Beatitudes, that are meant to apply between persons and extended them to apply them between state and state or between states and their citizens. In this respect, they fail to see the anger of God in judgment as the anger of love without hate. They commit the sin of refusing the God-given vocation to exercise the office of arrest and judgment. They cannot see that love in public relations, to quote wonderful theologian of the late 19th century, Peter Forsyth, they cannot see that love in the public takes the form of mutual respect of law, justice, liberty, and even help, especially with respect to the weak. So, in my judgment, to put it bluntly, I think that in many ways the most interesting theological form of contemporary sort of pacifism is the least illuminated when it comes to the problems that we face. They opt out of political life altogether, that would be the logic of it, or they fall back on the pious platitudes of pragmatic pacifism, or they buy into negative stereotypes of the state and the nation that correlate conveniently with their own theological commitments. In the latter case, they accept unwary generalizations about consumerism, globalization, capitalism, and the nation state. You get lots of moral energy, in my judgment, but they do not capture the realities that we have to deal with. And they will not help us in moving forward in the political and social arena. What would pacifist options really mean in the public square? Should we immediately disband the Defense Department and work for the reallocation of its funds, say to overseas aid or to tax relief? Should we replace armed police with unarmed security officers? Options like these in my judgment, are rarely canvassed by those who actually propose pacifist positions. And I don't think that's accidental, because they occupy what I would call a kind of la-la land. Now, the just war tradition. The central motivation behind the just war tradition, as we found it in, for example, Augustine, Ambrose, and Aquinas, is something like this. Love of our neighbours requires that we protect them when they are assaulted by violent evil. Love is not just a matter of refraining from violence, but of doing all we can to help our neighbours. It's one thing to refuse to engage in violence when we ourselves are attacked. It's another to refuse to use violence to protect other people who are unjustly attacked. Standing aside and letting others kill innocent civilians, in the end, is a matter of refusing to take responsibility for helping and loving other people. So we should be prepared on this analysis to do all we can, up to and including using lethal force, for example, to stop terrorists from killing innocent people. Now, that's the broad picture. Now, a distinction, as I did in the earlier case. I want to draw a distinction between what I'm going to call a maximalist vision of the just war tradition and what I'm going to call a minimalist version of the just war tradition. Now, I leave it to the eggheads in our midst to see whether, in fact, I've given up completely by the time I'm finished on the just war tradition. But I'll, as I say, that's for the exam afterwards. Now, the maximalist position is the drive to codify the criteria governing the use of lethal force. And those crucial elements are well known. There are 8 or 9 of them. I'll just give you some of them. For example, the war on terrorism, applied in this case, must repair or prevent some grave wrong. It must be declared by the legitimate authority, President, Congress, or Parliament. It must declare the aims of the war in advance. It must be engaged in as a last resort, after negotiation fails, and so on. There must be a reasonable chance of success. There must be proportionality. There must be right intention. And there must be just means must be used in carrying out the war on terrorism. Hence, we must distinguish between combatants, non-combatants, and so on. Now, while I admire the idealism at work in the maximalist position, I think it fails by setting in place dubious operational and moral straitjackets that may aid good judgment if used flexibly, but undercut it if deployed as an absolute code. Now, the language of war and terrorism may be central to masking one of the crucial problems that this vision of just war sort of has to confront. I think there's merit in speaking of the war on terrorism, just as there was merit on speaking, for example, of the Cold War in the 20th century. The metaphor of war and terrorism draws attention to the fact that we're not dealing with mere politics, that we're facing the use of lethal force, that crucial national interests are at stake, and that conventional civilian defences are inadequate to deal with the enemy. However, there cannot literally be a war on terrorism, for terrorism is simply one tactic in a network of tactics to deploy or to gain political ends. I mean, that's why, for example, in Ireland, terrorist groups had all sorts of other bells and whistles, like taking care of the poor and standing up for all sorts of wonderful causes. You never just simply have terrorism as a tactic. You have other stuff usually in tow. Thus, a critical assumption that we need to have in place in order to apply a strong version of the just war theory is missing. There is no conventional enemy, complete with a state and a conventional army. And there's often no standard declaration of war. In addition, it is often impossible to determine a reasonable chance of success. and to work out a just sense of proportionality by way of response. Now, of course, we can insist that it's enough if we can apply most of the criteria and do it in a relaxed manner. Say, in an Irish pub, after we've had some orange juice. And this, in fact, is in keeping with the developments behind the whole just war debate. The list of criteria I, in fact, cited are the final stages of a process of debate that's gone on for centuries. The move to codify is a later development, and I think it's an effort to formalize our best informal judgments. So perhaps we shouldn't worry too much if, in fact, it doesn't fit all the time. But of course, what you want to say, if you're committed to the just war tradition, is that we want to be able to say with a straight face that we have been morally just in our use of lethal force. Now, I think by this stage, the maximalist position is coming under severe strain. We have accepted that one crucial condition for just war theory is missing. There is no actual war. War and terrorism is a metaphor. We have conceded that crucial conditions of application have been abandoned, chances of success and proportionality. We have reinterpreted the history of the just war tradition as the development of a critical insight rather than code of conduct. And all that's left is that we act justly. I think we're knocking now on the door of what I'm going to call the minimalist version of just war. And I think that dealing appropriately with terrorism requires not just that we knock on that door, but that we walk through it. What is critically at stake in responding to terrorism is that we be justified in what we do, rather than that we be just in what we do. It would be wonderful to be just, but justice is not always possible. It is this insight that I think lies at the base of the just war tradition, which is why I want to sort of keep it afloat without abandoning it too quickly. The aim is to set limits to the use of lethal force and to foster a robust debate across the board in political and military and legal circles about what those limits are. Although, frankly, I don't trust lawyers any more than I do trust politicians. But differently, the goal is not to give up on justice, but to recognize there are circumstances when the ideal of justice is impossible. Thus, in my judgment, what we have to work on is the least of the evil options available to us, and then to argue our case in the public domain. As P.T. Forsyth insisted, it's not urged that war be made in order to do good, but to prevent the prevention of good, to resist wrong, and especially wrong to those who cannot resist for themselves. Now, underneath, therefore, the deployment of the just war tradition and the minimalist version that I want to hold to for the moment lies the ineradicable hand of human judgment, without which we would never have any codification in the first place. That judgment may be wise or unwise, informed or uninformed, good or bad. It'll always be imperfect, bound by the light of hindsight, and opened to criticism by intelligent opponents. It cannot be cast into some reliable method that will eradicate trust in fallible human agents, fallible human discernment, trained on particular challenges. There is no guarantee that we will be just at this level of our lives. We can, I think, insist that we be justified by way of prudence, intelligence, and the best moral sense we can muster. And we will be exceptionally fortunate if we have political and military leaders who can measure up to this logically imprecise but intellectually exacting standard. Now, it's important that we understand what's at stake in this minimalist version, as I'm still calling it, of the just war tradition. There is no claim that what we do represents an effort to establish the kingdom of God on earth. there is no claim of claiming divine sanction, or of any kind of appeal to direct appeal to divine revelation, at least for the moment. There is no effort to claim any kind of high moral ground. What is at stake is the goal of protecting the innocent, of restraining evil, and of doing so in a manner that may indeed be morally permissible, but is likely to be shot through with tragedy, moral dissonance, and even a bad conscience. Yet there's equally no pulling back from using the best practices that we can, short of lethal use of lethal force, and there is no distribution of blank moral checks to be filled at will. There's no setting up of the state action as a criterion of moral action, and there's no withdrawal into a private world of secrecy, disconnected from public evaluation, and there's no reduction of moral and political reason to mere technical reason. In short, there's no move to cut military and political action loose from morality and letting it swing away from ethical and theological evaluation. And the underlying assumptions then are these. The world is shot through with evil and sin. People deliberately and systematically reject the full resources of grace in their private and in their public lives. The default position in human life is war, not peace. It is conflict, not harmony. If you live in a period of relative peace, sing the doxology. Now, by the way, I'm not an Augustinian on the doctrine of sin because it doesn't go deep enough, but you can see that I'm within earshot of much of what Augustine is arguing. And the contingencies these assumptions entail must be taken with radical seriousness. And let me finish off with some general comments of where I am more broadly on this matter. I think in dealing with terrorism, we live on the edge of a moral apocalypse. In order to respond to it, some of those responsible for the welfare of others may land in places where our standard moral markers have been destroyed. In such circumstances, the only moral compass that may remain is the mandate to do the least bad thing in the circumstances. The best moves we make by way of justification of our actions is that we do the least evil, given all the options available. We can engage in justified action, but the depths of evil that we face has obliterated the option of just action or just war. Now, World War II may serve at this point as a precedent. The challenge presented by the emergence of total war was unparalleled. There was no limit to what Hitler would do in eliminating Jews, in killing non-combatants of enemy nations, and in the enforced coercion of his own civilians, including children, in the war with the Allies. If he had succeeded, the outcome would have been utterly catastrophic on all fronts for both victors and vanquished. In responding, there's no question that Winston Churchill led the Allies into reactions that failed the test of the just war tradition as developed by the maximalists. The chances of success were utterly precarious. There were very mixed intentions. The proportionality was highly questionable, and there were systematic, unrestrained attacks on non-combatants. Not surprisingly, there was a heated debate, moral and theological debate, in the Church of England at the time, represented by Bishop George Bell of Chichester and Bishop Cyril Garbett of York. Bell was convinced that the Allies were guilty of barbarism. Garbett argued that the choice was between the lesser of two evils. The dispute was never resolved, and I think honest differences will remain. Now, it's no surprise that the kind of destruction and suffering involved in World War II led us, if you read some of the literature on this, it led us to reach for language that went beyond mere secular description and borrowed from the language of faith. Observers of and participants in the terror let loose on civilians found themselves exactly in these circumstances. They naturally spoke of living through apocalypse, of doomsday scenarios, of facing hell on earth. Look at that fascinating eschatological language. They were enduring experiences that were worse than the end of the world. As is the case in some forms of where terrorists go nuclear, for example, we are already in the same position with respect to potential terrorist activity. After being lulled into a sense of false security with the end of the Cold War, we're now back living, in some respects, what I would call an apocalyptic world. The nuclear option is back on the table, and we have even fewer moral constraints in place in the social and political arena than we had, I suspect, in the early part of the 20th century. So what I'm getting at here is that I think in order to describe really radical evil, you need the language of eschatology. You need the language of apocalyptic. And in that world, you're really outside the utter normal standards of discourse. And then one other point I want to make before I finish. We also inhabit a wider political and international context that is subject to ongoing systematic change. We live neither in a time when the state has its own theological ideology that excludes the Christian voices in action in the public square, nor in the time when Christian leaders occupy and control the organs of state. I'm going back to Harwas's view here, that we live in a world of nation states. There are two big alternatives actually out there that in the theological literature. One is that we're living in the world of empire, and that the United States is, of course, the primary manifestation of empire in the contemporary world. And there's a whole history to that that's very interesting. But the one I'm particularly keen to call into question is the simple idea that, in fact, we live in a world that can be described any longer as a nation state. The state in the West, in fact, has changed dramatically in the last generation. It has moved, in the words of Philip Bobbitt, a very important observer in my judgment on these matters, it has moved from being a nation state to become a market state. Nation states can control their boundaries, their economics, their cultures, and their security. They seek to provide, in varying degrees, healthcare, education, and old age security. A cocktail of changes in communications and technology. In other areas, the failure of socialism and globalization, all of these are undermined, in my judgment, the nation state. And what we've now got are what we might call market states, to use the language of Bobbitt. Market states concentrate on maximizing opportunity. They balance public and private means of delivering public goods. They do it in different ways in Britain and the United States. They look to the marketplace and its practices as a criterion of success in what they do. Note the compromise originally on Obamacare. So whether you live in Moscow, London, Tokyo, Brussels, Berlin, Dublin, Seoul and the like, you're really living in a kind of market state. And politics and religion reflect the background music of the market state. So we have market churches, we have market preachers, we have market research-driven politicians. Even philanthropy is now administered on the model of market practices. We can rave and rant all we want about this, but I think that's where we now live. And it'll take time for the new religious, political, legal, and military dust to settle within that changing context. And I think it's not surprising that we find ourselves not only living at times in an apocalyptic world, but living actually just in a normal political world where we don't quite know where we are. In the meantime, and with this I finish, when the terrorists come knocking at my door, I want to have soldiers and a helicopter nearby. I want soldiers to take on those who are attacking the innocent, and I want a helicopter to take us to the hospital and fix us up. Now, I'd also love to have a robust church that's able to breed really effective politicians in the public order.